They pushed her off the platform like she was luggage. Nobody ordered. A woman who crossed half of America alone, rejected in 60 seconds, because of a mark on her face she was born with and never asked for. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, not pretty enough, not young enough, not perfect enough, this story will hit somewhere deep. Stay with us. Because the woman they threw away became something nobody in that town expected. Subscribe if you believe people deserve to be seen for who they truly are. This is her story. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Clara Whitmore's hands. 11 days during which she had read it 3 times, folded it carefully along the same creases each time, and placed it back inside the small wooden box she kept beneath her bed in the boarding house on Maple Street, Philadelphia. The letter was written in careful, measured handwriting, the kind that belongs to a man who chooses his words slowly, who thinks before he commits anything to paper. It came from a woman named Margaret Cooper, and it said in the kind of language people use when they want to sound generous without promising anything specific, that her son Edward was a good man, a hard-working man, a man who owned land in the Colorado Territory and needed a wife willing to build something real, not a woman chasing luxury, a woman willing to work. Clara had read that line 5 times. A woman willing to work. She almost laughed, not from amusement, but from recognition. That had been her entire life. Working, surviving, doing what needed to be done without complaint, without applause, without anyone asking whether she was tired or frightened or lonely. She wrote back the same evening. She was 31 years old, and she had not been proposed to before, not because no man had ever looked at her, but because most men stopped looking after the first glance. The birthmark covered the left side of her face, starting at her temple, moving down across her cheekbone, ending somewhere near her jaw. It was deep burgundy red, irregular, permanent. She had been born with it. Her mother used to touch it gently when Clara was very small, tracing its edges with her thumb the way you might touch something you found beautiful and unusual at the same time. "It's a map," her mother told her once, "of somewhere you're meant to go." Clara had believed that for exactly as long as her mother was alive. After the funeral, Clara was 9 years old. Nobody touched the birthmark gently anymore. The boarding house where she lived was run by a woman named Mrs. Holloway, who was not unkind, but was practical in the way that people become practical when sentiment has cost them too much. When Clara received the second letter from the Coopers confirming the arrangement, Mrs. Holloway brought her a cup of tea and sat across from her at the kitchen table. Colorado. Mrs. Holloway said it the way people say a word they've heard but never expected to use. "That's very far." "I know. You've never been west of Pittsburgh." "I know that too." Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a moment. She looked at Clara directly, which most people avoided doing for longer than a few seconds. "Are you sure they understand?" She stopped herself. Clara set down her cup. "That I have a birthmark on my face. I only meant—" "I told them." Clara's voice was steady. "I was honest. I described it clearly." Mrs. Holloway nodded slowly, but the expression on her face, that careful, worried, unconvinced expression, was one Clara had seen 1,000 times. It was the expression of someone who believed things would not go well, but did not want to be the one to say so. The Coopers' letters had never mentioned the birthmark directly. That was the first warning sign Clara had noticed and had chosen deliberately to set aside. She had written about it plainly in her first response, not apologetically, not dramatically, simply, honestly, the way you describe any physical feature that someone meeting you for the first time would notice. "I want you to know that I have a birthmark on the left side of my face. It is visible and permanent. I do not believe it changes what I am capable of or who I am as a person. But I believe you deserve to know before any agreement is made between us." Margaret Cooper's response had not mentioned it once. She wrote instead about the ranch, about the Colorado winters, about how Edward was a quiet man who appreciated quiet women. She wrote about the land. She wrote about opportunity. She never wrote, "We understand. It doesn't matter to us." Clara had noticed, and she had packed her suitcase anyway. The train journey took 4 days. She sat by the window for most of it, watching America move past her in long, slow sections. First the crowded cities, then the flat farmlands, then the strange emptiness of the plains, and finally, on the fourth morning, the mountains beginning to appear at the horizon, like something enormous, waking up slowly. She had never seen mountains before. They were not what she expected. She expected them to be beautiful in a distant postcard sort of way. Instead, they were overwhelming, not pretty exactly, but massive in a way that made everything she had ever worried about feel briefly impossibly small. She ate the food she had packed in a cloth bag. She slept in her seat. She spoke to no one. A woman across the aisle had smiled at her once. Early on the first day, a friendly, open smile. Then her eyes had traveled to the left side of Clara's face, and the smile had not disappeared entirely, but had shifted somehow, become careful, become a different kind of smile. Clara had turned back to the window. She was used to that particular shift. The moment when someone who was going to be warm decided to be polite instead. The station at Mill Haven, Colorado, was smaller than she imagined. There were maybe 30 people on the platform when the train pulled in. Ranchers, merchants, women in heavy coats, children running between adult legs. Clara stepped off train, holding her single suitcase. She stood still for a moment, letting the crowd move around her, looking for the people who were supposed to be looking for her. She saw them almost immediately. Margaret Cooper was a tall woman in her late 50s, with an expression that communicated without words that she ran things and expected to continue running them. Beside her stood two younger women, her daughters, Clara guessed, and a man in his 30s who had to be Edward. He was taller than she expected, broader through the shoulders. He had the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Clara walked toward them. She watched their faces during the 12 steps it took her to cross the platform. She watched because she always watched, had learned to watch, because in those unguarded seconds before people composed themselves, the truth lived. She watched Margaret Cooper's expression go from expectant to something else. Not immediately, not dramatically. But something moved behind the woman's eyes. Something shifted. The way a door shifts on its hinges when the wind changes direction. "Ciao, Mrs. Cooper." Clara stopped 3 feet away, held out her hand. "I'm Clara Whitmore. It's a pleasure to finally—" "Yes." Margaret Cooper shook her hand. Once, briefly. "We received your letters." Something was wrong already. Clara understood it the way you understand weather, not from one sign, but from the accumulation of small ones. The handshake that ended too quickly. The daughters who glanced at each other. Edward, who was standing slightly behind his mother and had not yet met Clara's eyes. "It was a long journey," Clara offered. "I'm glad to have arrived safely." "Of course." Margaret Cooper's voice was correct. Not warm. Correct. "We have the wagon. We can—" She paused. She looked at her son. Something passed between them in that look. "We can speak about the arrangements." Edward finally looked at Clara. For 3 seconds. Then he looked away. And Clara felt in those 3 seconds the entire architecture of the future she had traveled 4 days to reach beginning to crack quietly at its foundation. They did not invite her to sit in the wagon. That was the next thing. Margaret Cooper said that she needed to speak with the station master briefly, and the daughters said they needed to check something inside the station, and Edward said nothing. He simply walked away in the direction of the wagon without looking back. Clara stood on the platform with her suitcase. People moved around her. The train had already begun pulling away behind her. A child ran past close enough that Clara had to step sideways to avoid being knocked over. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The Cooper family did not return. Clara set her suitcase down. She sat on it. She clasped her hands in her lap and looked at the mountains which were still there, still enormous, still completely indifferent to the particular smallness of what was happening on this platform. 20 minutes. She thought about Mrs. Holloway's face, that careful, worried, unconvinced expression. She had been right. Of course, she had been right. People with that expression were usually right. Margaret Cooper returned alone. She walked with the particular purposefulness of someone who has made a decision they are not happy about, but are committed to. She stopped in front of Clara. She did not sit down. Miss Whitmore. Not Mrs. Not the name that would have come with a marriage. Miss. I am going to be direct with you because I believe you deserve directness. I would appreciate that, Clara said quietly. My son is not... Margaret Cooper paused, and in that pause, there was something that might, in a different person, have been guilt. He is not able to proceed with the arrangement as discussed. Clara waited. We felt that there were things not communicated clearly enough in the correspondence. I described my birthmark in my first letter. Clara's voice remained even. In specific detail. I have the copy I kept if... That is not what I am referring to. Margaret Cooper's jaw tightened. We had certain expectations regarding suitability, for the community, for the family's position. The word suitability landed like a stone. You mean my face, Clara said. I mean presentation. Margaret Cooper said the word carefully, as though choosing it from a selection. Our family has a standing in Millhaven. Edward needs a wife who presents appropriately in social situations. Clara stood up. She picked up her suitcase. She looked directly at Margaret Cooper, which seemed to make the woman uncomfortable. You had my letter, Clara said. You had my description. You arranged this journey. You told me to come. We did not anticipate. You did not want to anticipate. Clara's voice did not rise. It did not shake. But it had an edge in it now, the edge of someone who has been very patient for a very long time and has reached the limit of patience without crossing into cruelty. There is a difference. Margaret Cooper said nothing. What is your recommendation for what I do now? Clara asked. I have no family in Colorado. I spent most of my savings on this journey. You brought me here. Margaret Cooper opened her small purse. She produced some bills and held them out without meeting Clara's eyes. For the return journey, and perhaps a night's accommodation while you make arrangements. Clara looked at the money. She did not take it. Keep it, she said. I'll manage. The temperature dropped as the afternoon light began to thin. Clara sat on her suitcase in the same spot she had occupied for the last hour, watching Millhaven move around her, the merchants closing up their stalls, the ranchers heading back to their wagons, the families moving toward warmth and food, and the ordinary evening comfort of a home. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked at her for more than a second, except the ones who looked longer specifically because of the birthmark, who stared with that particular blunt curiosity that people think is invisible, but never is. Clara was cold. She had not eaten since before dawn. She had exactly $14 and some change in the inner pocket of her coat. The boarding house she had seen advertised near the station was $6 a night. She had looked at the sign on the way, in the habit of someone who had spent her life calculating margins carefully. $6 a night. She could afford 2 nights. 2 nights to find what work. In a town where she had no connections, no references within 1,000 miles, and a face that made most employers feel for reasons they could not or would not articulate uncomfortable. She sat very straight. She did not cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because crying here in public would make her visible in the wrong way, would make her a spectacle rather than a person, and she had spent too many years fighting against being reduced to spectacle to surrender to it now. She heard the boots before she heard the voice. They were unhurried boots, not the quick, purpose-driven footsteps of someone crossing from one destination to another, but the deliberate pace of someone who has spotted something and is approaching it directly. She didn't look up. Usually when someone approached her like this, it was to stare more closely at the birthmark without the social requirement of pretending they weren't. That's a cold place to sit. She looked up. The man standing in front of her was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that people who work physical land become lean, with the kind of weathered face that has spent years dealing with wind and sun without much concern for either. He was not looking at her birthmark. He was looking at her face, her whole face, the way most people never quite manage to do, the way that felt so unusual, it was almost startling. I'm waiting for something, Clara said, which was not entirely a lie. For how long? She hesitated. A while. He looked at the suitcase she was sitting on. He looked at the platform around her empty now, as the last of the day's travelers had moved on. He looked back at her face. "The Coopers," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You know them. Everybody knows everybody in Millhaven." He said it without inflection, not defensive of the town, not apologetic about it, simply accurate. "I saw you arrive on the same train. I saw Margaret Cooper walk away." "Then you know as much as there is to know." He nodded slowly. "What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore." "Sam Ward." He did not hold out his hand. He simply said the name the way you say a name when you're introducing yourself to an equal. "Are you planning to sleep on that suitcase?" "I'm planning to go to the boarding house." "Mrs. Tanner's place is full," he said. "She had a family arrive last week from Ohio, 4 of them. She's been sending people to the next town for the last 3 days." Clara absorbed this. "I didn't know that." "No, you wouldn't." He was quiet for a moment. "I have a ranch about 4 miles out. I'm not offering you anything except a warm room for the night and a meal. Tomorrow morning I can drive you back to town, and you can figure out your next step from there." She looked at him. He looked back. That same direct gaze, not studying the birthmark, not looking slightly away, just looking at her the way people looked at each other in normal conversation. "Why?" she asked. He tilted his head slightly. "Why what? Why are you offering?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to say something diplomatic, something about Christian charity, or neighborly duty, or the other comfortable phrases people use to dress up their reasons. "Because you've been sitting in the cold for close to 2 hours, he said. "And everybody who walked past you pretended not to see you. And that bothered me." Clara stood up. She picked up her suitcase. She looked at this man, this stranger with the direct gaze and the unhurried boots, and she made the kind of decision that requires you to trust your own judgment, even when your judgment has cost you before. "One night," she said. "One night," he agreed. She followed him toward the wagon, and she did not let herself think about whether this was the right decision, because she had learned over 31 years that some decisions cannot be measured by whether they are right or wrong, only by whether you are willing to make them. The wagon ride was mostly silent. Sam Ward drove without rushing. The horse knew the road. After about a mile, Clara said, "You didn't look at it." He glanced over at her briefly. "Your birthmark," she said. "Most people look at it. You didn't." "I noticed it," he said. "That's different from looking at it." "Is it?" "Most people, when they notice it, they keep looking. Or they look away very deliberately, and then keep looking when they think I won't see." She said this calmly, not bitterly. "You just looked at my face." Sam was quiet for a moment. "My father had a scar across his face," he said, "from a fire when he was young. I grew up watching people treat him like the scar was the most important fact about him." He paused. "It wasn't." Clara said nothing. The mountains were still visible in the last of the light, darker now, heavier, more solid. "For what it's worth," Sam Ward said, "the Coopers are fools." Clara looked at him. Something moved in her chest, small, quiet, unexpected. Not gratitude, not hope. Something older and more careful than either of those things. The beginning of trust measured out in the smallest possible amount, just enough to make it through the night. And when morning came, Clara Whitmore discovered that one night had a way of becoming something neither of them had planned for. The ranch was not what she expected. Not because it was grand, it wasn't. It was the opposite of grand. It was a house that had been functional once, and was now somewhere between functional and forgotten. The kind of place where things got fixed when they absolutely had to be, and ignored until that moment arrived. She noticed it the way a practical person notices these things, not with judgment, but with the automatic inventory of someone who had spent her life assessing situations and determining what could be salvaged. A meal was waiting. Sam had put a pot of beans on before he'd left for town, and they were still warm, and he set a bowl in front of her, without asking whether she was hungry, which she appreciated, because she was deeply the kind of hungry that 4 days of rationed food on a train, and 1 day of pure shock produce. She ate. He sat across from her and ate too. They did not speak much. But it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were both too tired and too honest to fill the air with words that didn't mean anything. When she finished, she set her spoon down and looked at him directly. "You said one night." "I did. I want to be clear that I'm not asking for more than that." She kept her voice level. "I'm not here to become a problem for you." Sam looked at her for a moment. "You're not a problem. You don't know me well enough to say that." "Fair." He leaned back slightly. "But I know you sat on a platform for 2 hours in the cold and didn't fall apart. That tells me something." Clara was quiet. Nobody had ever phrased it quite that way before, as a thing that revealed strength rather than desperation. "There's a room at the end of the hall," he said. "It has a lock on the door. You're welcome to use it." She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it simply, without the layer of complicated debt that gratitude sometimes carried. She went to bed. She lay in the dark in a room that smelled of old wood and something like cedar, and she stared at the ceiling, and she thought not with panic, but with the methodical clarity of a woman who had always been her own only resource about what came next. She had $14 and some change. She had no connections in Millhaven. She had a face that closed doors before she could open them. And she had at the moment a warm room with a lock on the door. That last part was not nothing. She went to sleep with the particular exhausted relief of someone who has survived a day that could have ended worse. She was awake before dawn. The habit of the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway's kitchen started at 5 and light sleepers either adapted or went hungry. She dressed. She went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. The coffee supplies were in a state that suggested a man who made coffee when he remembered to, which was not every day. She found the coffee. She found the pan. She built a fire in the stove with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. By the time Sam Ward appeared in the doorway, the coffee was ready. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the fire, at the coffee, at Clara standing at the stove with the particular composure of someone who had decided to be useful rather than wait to be told how. He said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed to the table and sat down. She poured 2 cups. She sat across from him. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I was awake." She wrapped both hands around her cup. And the stove was cold. It seemed practical. Sam looked at her over the rim of his cup. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Direct, not unkind, just direct. "I'm going to need work," she said. "Some kind of work. I have enough money for a short time, but not long." She paused. "Are there families in town that employ women for household work? Cooking, cleaning, child minding?" Sam set his cup down. "Some. Not many. Most households out here manage themselves." He was quiet for a moment. "There's the hotel. Mrs. Garfield sometimes takes on help for the dining room." "Would she consider me?" The question sat between them plainly. Sam met her eyes. "I don't know." She appreciated that he didn't lie to make her feel better. "That's an honest answer." "I try to give those." She nodded slowly. Outside, the light was beginning to change. She could see it in the thin strip visible through the kitchen window. The early gray of a Colorado morning. "I'll take you to town after breakfast," he said. "We can try Mrs. Garfield." "You don't need to accompany me." "I know I don't." He picked up his coffee again. "But Garfield is more likely to hire someone I vouch for than someone who walks in alone with no local references." Clara looked at him. I was not being charitable. He was being practical. And somehow the practicality of it was easier to accept than charity would have been. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. She might say no anyway." "She might." Clara picked up her own cup. "Most people do." Something moved across Sam Ward's face, brief, controlled, but real. "I know how that is," he said quietly. And something about the way he said it, not with pity for her, but with the flat recognition of shared experience, made Clara look at him more carefully. This was not a man who had moved through the world easily. She didn't know what had happened to him. Not yet. But she recognized the shape of it the particular way that difficulty leaves its mark on a person, not on their face, but in the economy of their words and the way they moved through a room like someone who expected quietly and without drama to handle things alone. She had seen that shape in her own mirror for 31 years. Mrs. Garfield said no. She said it politely with the kind of regret that people perform when they want to feel better about a decision they've already made before the conversation started. "I'm fully staffed at the moment," Mrs. Garfield said, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "But I'll keep you in mind if anything opens up." Sam had introduced Clara directly, steadily, without apology and without over-explanation. Simply, "This is Clara Whitmore. She's looking for work. She's capable, and I can personally speak to her character." It hadn't mattered. Clara had watched Mrs. Garfield's eyes move to the left side of her face in the first 3 seconds, and she had known then with the certainty of long experience that the answer was already decided. Outside on the boardwalk, she stood for a moment without speaking. Sam stood beside her. "Haberdashery might need someone," he said. "Or the seamstress on the east end of town. How many times do you think we'll hear the same answer before it becomes clear?" She hadn't meant to say that out loud. The words came out not with bitterness, she was too tired for bitterness, but with the flat honesty of someone who has stopped performing optimism for the benefit of other people. Sam was quiet. "I need you to be direct with me," she said. "Not kind, direct. What are my actual options in this town?" He looked at her for a moment. "Your actual options." He said it slowly, like he was weighing each word. "Are limited. Not because you're not capable, you clearly are. Because this is a small town, and small towns are slow to trust newcomers, and—" He stopped. "And," she pressed, "and you have a face that people here don't know how to look at yet." He said it plainly without cruelty. "That's not a permanent condition. It's a starting condition. But right now, it's the reality." Nobody had ever said that to her quite so directly. Not unkindly, not cruelly, just truthfully. Clara breathed in once. "So what do you suggest?" Sam looked at her. Then he looked away at the street, then back. "I have a proposition," he said. "Not what you came here for. Nothing like what you came here for. But practical." She waited. "My ranch needs work," he said. "Real work, not just cleaning and cooking, though Lord knows both of those things would help. I'm behind on everything. I've been running it alone for 3 years and it shows." He paused. "I can't pay much, but I can pay something, and there's the room and the meals. While you stay, you can save what I pay you. You'd have time to figure out a longer plan. And—" He stopped again. "And," she said again, "and you'd be 4 miles out from people who judge you based on what they see in the first 10 seconds. He said it simply. "That might be worth something on its own." Clara stood very still. She was 31 years old, and she had been told in various ways, and by various people, that she should be grateful for whatever was offered. That she should not expect too much. That her circumstances, meaning her face, always her face, meant she had to accept what other people decided to give her. This was different. This was a man offering her something specific, something practical with clear terms and no hidden sentiment draped over the top of it. "What would the arrangement look like?" she asked. "You manage the household side. I handle the ranch work. I pay you $4 a week. You have full use of the kitchen and your room." He met her eyes. "You leave whenever you decide to leave. No questions. No obligations beyond the work itself." $4 a week. 20 cents more than Mrs. Holloway's boarding house in Philadelphia had paid her for doing twice that amount of work. "I want one more thing," Clara said. He raised an eyebrow. "I want it understood clearly by you and by anyone in town who asks that this is an employment arrangement. Nothing else. I came here as a potential wife, and that arrangement ended before it started. I am not looking for a replacement version of it." Something shifted in Sam Ward's expression. Not offense, not amusement, but something closer to respect. "Understood completely," he said. "Then I accept," Clara said. She held out her hand. He shook it. The grip was firm on both sides. She threw herself into the work, the way she always threw herself into things, completely, without reservation, with the focused energy of someone who has learned that moving forward is the only direction that doesn't lead to collapse. The kitchen came first because it was the most immediate disaster. She reorganized it methodically, not to make it pretty, but to make it functional, which is a different kind of order, entirely. A pragmatic order built around how a person actually moves through a space and what they reach for first. She found some supplies that had been forgotten in corners and used what was still good. She started keeping a list: what was running low, what needed replacing, what could be stretched further with a little thought. Sam came in for supper on the first evening and stopped in the doorway the same way he had stopped that morning. The table was set. There was actual food, not beans from a pot left on since morning, but a proper meal made from what she had found and what she had asked him that afternoon to add to his next supply run. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "This is the job." She set the pot on the table. "Sit down." He sat down. He ate. After a while, he said quietly, "This is the first hot meal I've had in—" He stopped. "A while." Clara didn't make anything of it. "Is there a pattern to when you go into town for supplies?" "Not much of a pattern," he admitted. "We should establish one." She pulled out the list she'd made. "These are the things that need restocking in the next 2 weeks. If you go on Saturdays, we can plan around it." He looked at the list. He looked at her. "You made this today, this morning, between the curtains and the—" She stopped because she had almost said the disaster you call a pantry and caught herself. "Between tasks." Sam looked back at the list. "The curtains," he said. "The ones in the front room were letting in cold air. I found spare material in the chest near the window. I reattached the hems." She picked up her fork. "It's not beautiful, but it's functional." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been meaning to do that since October," he said. "It's February." "I know." Something passed between them, not quite humor, but the distant cousin of it, the kind of thing that lives on the edge of a shared recognition. Clara looked at her plate. Sam looked at his. And the silence that came after was, for the first time in longer than either of them could clearly remember, genuinely comfortable. The first week was a negotiation between two people who had both lived alone long enough to develop strong opinions about how things should be done, and strong discomfort with the idea of imposing those opinions on anyone. Sam was methodical in his ranch work. Disciplined, precise. The kind of person who did the same tasks in the same order every morning without needing to think about it. He was less methodical about everything else. He left tools in wrong places. He forgot to close the back door, which let the cold in. He had a habit of leaving half-finished cups of coffee on every surface in the house, apparently unaware that this was happening. Clara did not comment on any of these things directly. She moved the tools back. She closed the door. She collected the cups. On the fourth day, Sam came inside and noticed his coffee had been transferred to a single spot near the stove, a deliberate, visible single spot. He looked at it. He looked at Clara, who was kneading bread at the table, and was very focused on the bread. "Is this a message?" he asked. "It's a cup of coffee," she said without looking up. He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed to the spot, picked up the cup, and drank from it. "Fair enough," he said. And that was the closest they came in the first week to having an argument. On the 8th day, she went into town alone. Sam had offered to drive her. She had declined. She needed to understand the town on her own terms, not filtered through the goodwill of a local man who vouched for her, because his goodwill would not always be available, and she could not afford to need it. She walked the main street of Millhaven with her head up and her pace steady. She went to the general store. She purchased the items on the list, the ones that were her responsibility to source, and she counted out her money carefully, because $4 a week was not much, and she was already calculating the future in narrow margins. The man at the store, middle-aged, broad, with the look of someone who had run this store his entire adult life, served her without comment. He looked at the birthmark for exactly 1 second, and then looked at the list she had handed him, and did not look up again until he was done filling the order. It was the most normal interaction she had in Millhaven up to that point. She almost thanked him specifically for it. She didn't. But she noticed it, stored it the way you store small acts of decency when they're rare enough to matter. On her way back out of the store, she almost walked directly into a woman coming in the other direction. They both stepped back. The woman was around Clara's age, maybe a few years younger, with bright eyes and the energetic quality of someone for whom stillness was a personal challenge. "Oh, sorry, I nearly—" The woman looked at Clara. She looked at the birthmark. And then, unlike almost everyone else in Millhaven, she continued making eye contact as if nothing particular had happened. "You're the woman staying at Sam Ward's place." It was not a question. "I'm working there," Clara said. "Yes." "Ruth Hale." The woman held out her hand the same direct way that Sam had introduced himself. "My husband Tom has the adjacent property north of Sam's." "Clara Whitmore." Ruth Hale's handshake was brisk and warm. "I heard what the Coopers did." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not gossip, not condemnation of Clara, just statement. "Margaret Cooper is a woman who has opinions about surfaces and not much else." Clara stared at her for a moment. Then something in her chest released small, involuntary. "That's a very accurate description," she said. Ruth laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. "How are you getting on at Sam's?" she asked. "That man has needed someone to organize his kitchen since his mother died." "When did his mother die?" Ruth looked at her. "He hasn't told you. We don't talk very much about personal history." Ruth tilted her head slightly. "She passed 3 years ago. It's when Sam came back to the ranch. He'd been working a cattle drive up north. He came back to take care of her, and then she was gone before he could." She paused. "He's been out there alone ever since." Clara absorbed this. 3 years of meals from a forgotten pot. 3 years of tools left in wrong places and half-finished cups of coffee and curtains letting in the cold. 3 years of a man managing grief. The way practical men manage grief, by working harder and speaking less. She had recognized the shape of it. Now she understood it more clearly. That evening, she made something more than practical for supper. She made the apple cake that Mrs. Holloway had taught her in the early years at the boarding house, the one that required patience and took the better part of an afternoon. Sam came in from the ranch work and stopped in the doorway for the third time, as he apparently always stopped in the doorway, which she was beginning to understand was his version of adjusting to whatever he found that he hadn't left that way. "What's the occasion?" he asked. "No occasion." She cut a piece and set it in front of him. "Sit down." He sat. He ate a bite. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to make something like this," he said. His voice was careful. Not emotional, just careful, the way you're careful with something that could break. "Ruth Hale mentioned her," Clara said. He looked up. "She told me she passed 3 years ago," Clara said. Direct. Because she had decided that the currency of this household was directness, and she would not handle the subject like something fragile, when he himself had never once handled her with that kind of patronizing care. "I'm sorry." Sam was quiet. "She would have liked you," he said finally. Clara set down her fork. "Why?" "Because you don't waste words." He looked at the cake. "And you bake things on days that aren't occasions. She did that too." Something moved in Clara's chest again. Not small this time, a little larger, a little less careful. She picked her fork back up. "Tell me about her," she said. And Sam Ward, who had lived 3 years in a house full of silence, began to talk. By the end of the second week, something had shifted in the ranch. Not dramatically, not in any single visible moment, but in the accumulation of small changes that add up the way water adds up in a dry place gradually until the ground has changed character. The kitchen ran smoothly. Meals appeared at regular times. The supply list worked. Sam stopped leaving the back door open, not because Clara had asked him to, but because he had noticed the cold came in, and she moved to close it every time. And somewhere in that observation was something that functioned like courtesy. He started saying what time he expected to finish in the evening, which meant she didn't have to estimate when supper needed to be ready. She started leaving his coffee in the same spot every morning, hot as reliably as the sun. These were small things, but small things in a household that had forgotten what regularity felt like were enormous. Ruth Hale came to visit on a Tuesday morning with a jar of preserves and the specific energy of a woman who was conducting a friendly investigation under the cover of a social call. She sat at Clara's kitchen table and watched Clara work and talked about Millhaven, about the neighbors, about the winter. And Clara understood that she was also gently and without malice gathering information about the situation at Sam Ward's ranch. Because in a town of this size, people cared about each other's business in ways that were sometimes intrusive and sometimes genuinely warm, and Ruth Hale appeared to be the latter kind. "People are talking," Ruth said eventually, with the directness Clara was beginning to appreciate about her. "About you being here." "I assumed they would be." Clara didn't look up from the vegetables she was cutting. "Most of them are curious more than anything. And the ones who are more than curious." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Margaret Cooper told someone that Sam took in a charity case." The knife stopped. Clara set it down carefully. She breathed in once. "That's what she said. Not a question. That's what I heard." Ruth's voice was gentle, but she didn't soften the information which Clara respected. "I want you to know that the people who heard her say it are not. Most of them are not people who take Margaret Cooper at her word automatically." Clara picked the knife back up. She resumed cutting. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I do the work I'm paid to do. That's an employment arrangement. It has nothing to do with charity." "I know that." Ruth's voice was firm. "And if you want, I'll make sure the right people know it too." Clara looked at her. In the boarding house in Philadelphia, in every room she had ever occupied, there had never been a woman who offered this, who sat at her table and said, "I'll stand behind you without being asked, without anything attached to it." "Why would you do that for me?" Clara asked. "You barely know me." Ruth looked at her steadily. "Because Margaret Cooper is someone who decided what you were worth in the first 3 seconds and hasn't thought about it once since." She paused. "And I find that kind of thinking offensive on principle." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thank you, Ruth." It came out differently than it usually did. More honest, less defended. Ruth nodded briskly, as if the matter was settled, and moved on to asking about whether Clara had enough butter for the week, and the conversation shifted and became ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own kind of gift. Sam found out about what Margaret Cooper had said. He found out on Saturday in town from Tom Hale, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a man who is delivering information he thinks someone should have. He came home quieter than usual. Clara noticed, because she noticed most things had spent a lifetime developing that skill, but she said nothing at supper. After supper she was clearing the table when he said, "I heard what Margaret Cooper is saying about you." She set down what she was holding. "I heard it too. I'm sorry." "You don't need to apologize for what she says." "I'm not apologizing for her." His voice had an edge, controlled but real. I should have done something at the station, when she left you there. I saw it happen. I was on the other side of the platform." He stopped. "I should have said something then." Clara turned to face him. "You came back," she said. "Later. When it mattered. That's not the same as Sam." She said it plainly. "You did not cause what she did. You came back to a platform where everybody else had walked away, and you offered me something real and practical when you didn't have to." She held his eyes. "Don't borrow responsibility that isn't yours." He was quiet. The edge in his voice was still there, but it had shifted, become less about Margaret Cooper and more about something internal, something older. "People here have been talking about me for 3 years," he said. "Since my mother died. They say I've let the ranch go, that I'm not, that I've become strange, too isolated." He said it flatly. "They're not entirely wrong." Clara looked at him carefully. "You're not strange," she said. "You're a person who's been alone too long." He looked up. "There's a difference," she said. "Strange is something wrong with you. Alone too long is something that happened to you." She picked up what she'd set down and went back to clearing the table. "Both of us have spent a lot of time letting other people's wrong descriptions sit on us like they belong there. They don't." Silence. Then very quietly, "Not weak, not broken. Just honest, in the way that men who are rarely honest about such things sound when they allow it. When did you figure that out? Clara thought about her mother's thumb tracing the edges of the birthmark, like it was a map to somewhere she was meant to go. I'm still figuring it out, she said, but I'm further along than I was. Sam Ward looked at her across the kitchen, this woman who had arrived on a train 4 days ago and was rejected before she could speak, and had turned it through sheer refusal to collapse into something completely different. He said nothing more. But that night, for the first time in 3 years, he didn't eat supper alone in silence. He ate it in the quiet company of someone who understood that silence and loneliness were not the same thing. And that was a beginning real and unmistakable, the way the first light of morning is real, long before the sun has fully risen. And like all real beginnings, it carried within it the seeds of everything that would eventually force both of them to decide who they actually were. The third week brought something neither of them expected. Not warmth they already had, that in the cautious, practical way that two self-sufficient people allow warmth without naming it. What the third week brought was trouble. The specific small-town kind of trouble that moves quietly until it doesn't. That starts as a whisper and arrives at your door as something you have to stand up to or be permanently reduced by. It started on a Wednesday. Sam had gone into town for the weekly supply run, the organized Saturday run, having shifted because one of the horses had thrown a shoe and needed the farrier on short notice. Clara had stayed at the ranch. She was in the middle of reorganizing the storage shed, a project that required the particular stubbornness of someone willing to handle 3 years of accumulated disorder without flinching when she heard the wagon. She came out assuming it was Sam returning early. It was not Sam. It was Edward Cooper. He sat in a small buggy alone, his broad shoulders folded forward slightly in the way of a man who is not sure of his welcome and is trying to look like he is. He was better looking up close than he had seemed on the platform, or he would have been, if his expression hadn't carried the particular quality of someone who has done something they know was wrong and has spent 2 weeks constructing reasons why it wasn't. Clara stood in front of the storage shed. She did not move toward him. She did not smile. She waited. Edward Cooper climbed down from the buggy. He held his hat in both hands, the gesture of a man trying to signal humility without fully committing to it. Miss Whitmore. He stopped at about 6 feet away. I wanted to come and... He paused. I owe you an apology. Clara said nothing. He kept going, filling her silence. The way guilty people fill silence with more words than the situation required. What happened at the station, the way my family handled things, that wasn't right. I know that. I've thought about it a great deal since. Have you? Her voice was flat. Not cruel, just flat. I want you to know that the decision wasn't it wasn't only my decision. His jaw tightened. My mother has strong opinions about... Stop. Clara's voice was quiet, but it cut through his sentence cleanly. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. He blinked. All right. Did you read my first letter, the one where I described my birthmark clearly? A pause. My mother handled the correspondence. That's not what I asked. She kept her eyes on him. Did you read it? The pause was longer this time. I read parts of it, he said. Which parts? He looked away briefly. That was his answer. Clara breathed in once through her nose. You didn't read it. Your mother showed you what she wanted you to see, and you let her arrange everything. And when I stepped off that train, you let her make a decision that affected my entire life, without saying a single word. Edward's jaw worked. I know that. You're not here because you're sorry, she said. Not a judgment, a simple, careful observation. You're here because you feel guilty. Those are different things. He looked at her, then really looked in a way he hadn't on the platform. What's the difference? Sorry changes your behavior, Clara said. Guilty just makes you uncomfortable until you find a way to feel better about yourself. The words landed. She watched them land. Edward Cooper stood in front of her with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had expected something absolution perhaps, or at least a softer version of the truth, and had received neither. Is there anything I can do, he asked, to help your situation? My situation is fine, she said. I have work and I have shelter and I'm managing. I don't need anything from you. He nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something more. He didn't. He climbed back into the buggy, set his hat on his head, and drove away without looking back. Clara stood in front of the storage shed for a long moment after the buggy disappeared. Then she went back inside and kept working. But her hands, for the first time since she arrived in Colorado, were not quite steady. Sam came home to find the storage shed reorganized, and Clara at the kitchen table with a cup of tea sitting very straight, very still, in the posture of someone actively maintaining composure. He noticed. Because he noticed most things about her now, the way she sat, the way she moved, the specific texture of her silences. He put the supplies down. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He sat across from her. He waited. Clara looked at her cup. Edward Cooper came while you were in town. Sam went very still. He said he wanted to apologize. She looked up. He wanted to feel better. There's a difference. What did he say? What guilty people say? She set her cup down. That he was sorry. That his mother handled things. That it wasn't entirely his decision. She paused. He didn't read my letter. The one I described the birthmark in. His mother managed the correspondence and showed him what she wanted him to see. Sam's expression tightened. He came here. He drove 4 miles to tell me he felt bad. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, not tears, but the suppressed weight of everything she had held together with sheer will since the moment she stepped off that train. Which is something, I suppose. It's not enough. No. She picked up her cup again. It's not. Sam was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? Clara looked at him. It was such a simple question. It was the kind of question people asked as a formality, usually the kind you answered with fine without thinking about it. I don't know, she said, because his directness had taught her that this was the correct currency between them. Seeing him brought it back. The platform. The way they all looked at me and then looked away. She paused. I've spent a long time being very competent about not letting that kind of thing matter. And mostly I succeed. But sometimes it... She stopped. It catches you, Sam said quietly. Yes. He nodded. He understood this. Not because he was being kind, because he genuinely understood it. My father, he said. The scar on his face. He used to say that you never stop feeling the first look. You just get faster at recovering from it. Clara looked at him. Did he recover? Every day. Sam held her eyes. That's not failure. That's practice. Something in Clara's chest settled, not resolved, not healed, but settled the way a wound settles when it's being treated correctly. I told him the difference between sorry and guilty, she said. Sam almost smiled. Almost. I imagined that landed. It did. And something close to dry humor moved across her face, brief, genuine. He had nothing to say after that. Good. She stood up. She went back to the stove. She started making supper. And Sam Ward sat at the kitchen table and watched her move through the kitchen with the particular efficiency and quiet dignity of a woman who was not going to be diminished by Edward Cooper or his mother or anyone else in Millhaven. And he felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Something he was not ready to name, but could no longer pretend he wasn't feeling. The gathering happened on the last Saturday of the month. Millhaven held them seasonally, not quite dances, not quite town meetings, but the specific social event of a small frontier community where people needed reasons to come together and check that everyone was still standing. Ruth Hale had told Clara about it 2 weeks in advance in the firm tone of someone who was not asking whether Clara planned to attend, but informing her that she would. You can't stay 4 miles out of town forever, Ruth said. People need to see you. The longer you stay invisible, the easier it is for Margaret Cooper's version of you to be the only version they know. Clara understood the logic. She also understood the cost of it. Sam drove her to town. He didn't make anything of it. Didn't say he was coming specifically for her, just appeared in the wagon at the time they'd need to leave, and waited while she put on her good coat. She was quiet on the drive in. He let her be quiet. When they arrived, she could feel the shift in the room, that particular charged awareness that moves through a crowd when someone unexpected has walked in. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they paused fractionally and resumed at a slightly different register. She knew what they were looking at. She kept her head up. Ruth appeared at her side within 30 seconds, practically materialized the way people do when they've been watching for you. "You came," Ruth said with genuine warmth. "You didn't exactly give me a choice," Clara said. Smart woman. Ruth linked her arm through Clara's with a naturalness that felt surprisingly exactly right. Deliberate in its public warmth, yes, but also real. Ruth Hale was not a woman who performed friendship. Sam had been pulled into conversation with Tom Hale near the door. Clara moved through the room with Ruth, and people spoke to her cautiously, curiously, but directly, and she answered them directly because she had learned a long time ago that people in new social situations take their cues from the newcomer, and if she treated herself as someone who expected to be treated with basic decency, most people would follow that lead. Not all people, but most. She was doing well. And then she heard the voice. It came from her left, a woman in a group of 3 speaking to her companions with the particular carrying tone of someone who wants to be heard without appearing to address anyone directly. "I heard she arrived with practically nothing. The Coopers were generous enough to give her money for the journey home, and she refused it, if you can believe that." Clara recognized the voice. Margaret Cooper. She did not turn around. Ruth's arm stiffened slightly beneath hers. "Pride, I suppose," another woman's voice added, "though it seems misplaced given the circumstances." "Sam Ward is too kind-hearted for his own good," Margaret Cooper continued, "taking in someone the family couldn't." She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who enjoys the precision. "Couldn't accommodate." Ruth turned toward the sound. Clara caught her arm. "Don't," Clara said quietly. "She's saying these things loud enough to be sure you hear them." Ruth's voice was controlled, but her eyes were sharp. "I know. And you're just going to—" "I'm going to stand here and not give her the satisfaction of making this into a scene," Clara said, still quiet, still steady. "Because a scene is what she wants. A scene makes me the problem." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then, with the expression of someone who deeply respects a strategy while finding it personally difficult to execute, "You're a better woman than I am." "You don't know that," Clara said. "I'm just more practiced at this particular situation." She was doing well, right up until the moment when a man she didn't know, 50s, heavy-set, the kind of man who has always spoken loudly and never found reason to stop, turned from a nearby conversation and looked at her with the blunt, unguarded assessment of someone who doesn't consider other people's dignity a relevant constraint. "You're the woman Ward took in," he said. Not to anyone specifically. Just said it in her direction as statement of fact that required her acknowledgement. "I'm the woman who works at Ward's ranch," Clara said. "Yes." The man looked at her birthmark, openly. The way you look at something unusual in a shop window without the pretense of looking elsewhere. "Heard the Coopers had arranged a marriage for you," he said. "Didn't work out." The room had gone quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Clara held the man's gaze. "The arrangement was ended by the Coopers when I arrived." "Yes." "Because of—" He gestured vaguely at her face. The quiet spread further, and Clara felt it, the particular weight of a room full of people watching to see what she would do. That terrible suspended moment when you are simultaneously a person and a test case, when your response will define in this community who you are for a long time to come. She breathed in once. She was about to speak. She didn't get the chance. "Because of nothing that concerns you, Walt." Sam's voice came from behind her, level calm, without a single degree of aggression, which somehow made it more absolute than anger would have been. The man Walt looked over Clara's shoulder. Sam stepped up beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. The distinction was deliberate, and Clara registered it immediately. He was not shielding her, not taking over. He was standing next to her. "I was just making conversation," Walt said. The bluntness had receded somewhat. You were making her explain herself to a room full of people she doesn't know, Sam said. That's not conversation. That's something else. The quiet was complete now. Clara could feel every person in the room choosing which direction to look. Walt's expression shifted. No offense intended to the lady. Then offer none, Sam said. Simply. Finally. Walt looked at Clara. He had the grace at least to look mildly ashamed. I apologize, Miss Whitmore. Clara looked at him steadily. Thank you. She turned to Sam. He met her eyes. Something moved between them. Not words. Not yet, but something real and direct and unmistakable. The kind of communication that happens when two people have spent enough time in close company to develop a language that doesn't require speaking. She turned back to the room. She straightened her shoulders. She said to the room in general, with the clear, unhurried voice of someone who has decided this is the moment, I came to Millhaven as a mail-order bride for the Cooper family. When I arrived, the arrangement was ended because of how I look. She paused. I am currently employed at Ward's Ranch. The work is honest and the arrangement is fair. I intend to stay in Millhaven as long as I'm able and as long as I'm useful. Another pause. That's the full story. I'd rather it be known plainly than guessed at incorrectly. The room was still. Then Tom Hale from near the door said, That sounds about right to me. And that simple, dry, matter-of-fact endorsement from a man the town respected broke the moment. Conversations resumed. People moved. The particular pressure of the gathered room's attention dispersed like steam. Ruth Hale gripped Clara's arm with a brief, fierce pressure that said everything she wasn't saying out loud. Clara released a breath she hadn't been aware she was holding. Sam was still beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. On the ride home, the silence between them was different. It was the silence of two people who have experienced something significant together and are still too close to it to speak. About a mile from the ranch, Clara said, You didn't have to do that. I know. I was about to handle it myself. I know that too. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I wasn't trying to handle it for you. I just... A pause. Walt Briggs is someone who has run over people his entire life because nobody ever told him directly to stop. I've been watching him do it for years. He paused again. I should have stopped him sooner, before you became the one he was doing it to. Clara thought about that. You said something to the town, she said. By standing there, by speaking. I said something to Walt Briggs. You said it to everybody in that room. She turned to look at his profile. You understand that? A pause. Yes, he said quietly. I understand that. People will talk about it, she said. About what it means, that you stood beside me. People talk about everything. A beat. Let them. Clara looked at him. This man who had lived 3 years alone, who had gotten quieter and smaller and more contained in the way that grief makes people smaller, and who had tonight in a crowded room in front of every person in Millhaven chosen to stand beside a woman that his community had been content to dismiss. Sam, she said. He glanced at her. Thank you. Not the practical thank you she had offered him on the platform 3 weeks ago, the clean, uncomplicated gratitude of one stranger to another. This was different, fuller, more honest. He looked back at the road. His hands on the reins were still. Don't mention it, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man saying the opposite of what he means not to deceive, but because the truth of what he means is too large for the available words. She found the box 3 days later. She was not snooping. That needs to be said clearly. Clara Whitmore was constitutionally incapable of snooping, having spent a lifetime protecting her own privacy, with the ferocity of someone who knew exactly how it felt to have private things handled by careless people. She was cleaning the room that Sam used as a small study. A room he had told her was fine to clean when she got around to it, and she had gotten around to it, and she was moving things from the floor to the desk, in the particular methodical way she moved through disorder, and the box was on the floor behind the chair tucked against the wall, and when she moved it to put it on the desk, it wasn't closed properly, and the contents shifted, and something fell out. A photograph. She picked it up. It was a woman, older, maybe 60, with a strong face, and the kind of eyes that looked directly at the camera without any self-consciousness. The way people looked at cameras before they became a thing you performed for. And next to her in the photograph was a much younger Sam 20, maybe with more ease in his face than the man she knew. The ease of a person who has not yet lost the things that will eventually require him to choose between bitterness and discipline. His mother. Clara held the photograph for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the desk with the deliberate gentleness of someone handling another person's most private thing. And she found next to where the photograph had been in the box a stack of letters. She did not read the letters, but she saw the handwriting on the outside of the top one. For Samuel. When he's ready. The handwriting was a woman's. Careful. Deliberate. His mother had left him letters, and the box had been on the floor behind the chair, in the room Sam never fully used for 3 years, and he had never opened them. Clara put the box on the desk. She stood very still. She understood something in that moment, something that clarified the entire architecture of Sam Ward for her, that explained the particular quality of his silence, and the way he moved through his own house, like a man in a room he wasn't sure he deserved to be in. He had come home to take care of his mother and arrived to find her already gone. And she had left him letters, and he hadn't been able to open them. For 3 years. Clara went back to the kitchen. She did not say anything to Sam at supper. She served the meal. She ate. She listened to him talk about the fence line he was repairing on the east side of the property. She waited until he had finished eating. Then she said carefully, "I was cleaning the study today." He looked up. "I moved the box from the floor to the desk," she said. "The one behind the chair. I wasn't looking through it, it wasn't fully closed, and a photograph fell out. I put it back." Sam was very still. "The photograph of you and your mother," she added. "You look like her, around the eyes." He said nothing for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table. "I know the letters are in there," Clara said. "I didn't read them, but I saw the outside of the top one, her handwriting." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's not my place. But—" She stopped, then continued. 3 years is a long time to leave something that important behind a chair." The silence was long and complicated. Sam looked at the table. When he finally looked up, his face had an expression she had not seen on it before. Not broken, not collapsing, but stripped somehow of the careful control that he wore the way other people wore hats. "I got to the ranch a week after she died," he said. "I'd ridden hard. I thought I might still—" He stopped. "There was a neighbor woman here when I arrived. She'd laid everything out. The house was clean. My mother was—" He stopped again. "The neighbor told me she'd left letters for me, in the study." Clara waited. "I walked into the study," he said. "I saw the box. I couldn't." He exhaled slowly. "I told myself I'd read them when I was ready. I put them on the floor behind the chair so I wouldn't see them every day." He looked at Clara directly. "I've never been ready." The silence that followed was one of the heaviest Clara had ever sat inside. Then quietly, "What if they say something I can't carry?" Clara held his gaze. "What if they say something you've been carrying without knowing it?" she said carefully, "because you never had the words for it." Sam looked at her. The expression on his face was something she recognized with the specificity of personal experience. The face of someone standing at the edge of a hard thing, calculating whether they are strong enough to step forward. She had stood at that edge many times. She knew it did not get easier with waiting. You don't have to read them thing to want. And I would be there. Sam Ward looked at Clara Whitmore across the kitchen table, and something happened in his eyes. Not tears, not quite, but the thing that lives next to tears in people who have not allowed themselves to cry in a very long time. He stood up. He walked out of the kitchen. She heard his footsteps move down the hall. She heard the door to the study open. She sat at the kitchen table, and she waited. 15 minutes passed. 20. She made a fresh pot of coffee. She poured 2 cups. She set one at his place at the table, and kept hers in her hands. 30 minutes. The study door opened. His footsteps came back down the hall. He came into the kitchen. His face was different, cleared somehow. The way a sky looks different after a storm moves through it, not lighter exactly, but cleaner, more honest about what it is. He sat down. He saw the coffee at his place. He picked it up. He drank. Clara said nothing. After a long moment, Sam set the cup down and looked at her with the expression of a man who is seeing something clearly for the first time after a long period of deliberate not looking. "She knew," he said quietly. "In the letters. She knew I'd wait too long to come back. She said—" He stopped. He breathed. "She said the ranch was always meant to be a home, not just land, and that a home needs more than one person to be what it's supposed to be." Clara was very still. "She wrote that 3 years ago," he said. "And I've been living in this house alone ever since, not understanding why it felt like something was permanently missing." He looked at Clara. "She knew before I did." The kitchen was quiet. The coffee was warm. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and cold and indifferent, the way it always was, the way it always would be. And inside, in the small, reorganized, gradually warming kitchen of Sam Ward's ranch, two people who had both been told in different ways that they were not quite enough sat with the quiet, staggering weight of the possibility that they might be exactly enough for exactly this. Neither of them said it. Neither of them needed to. Not yet. But the thing was there between them, real and solid as the table they sat at. And it was not going anywhere, that thing sitting between them, real and solid as the table they shared, and in the weeks that followed, it grew, the way honest things grow, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the quiet, stubborn persistence of something that has decided it belongs. March arrived and brought with it the particular cruelty of late winter on the Colorado frontier, the kind of cold that makes a person feel the season is personal, that it has singled you out specifically for discomfort. The work on the ranch intensified. The fence lines needed attention after the hard freeze. 2 of the cattle had to be moved to the inner pen. The supply runs became more frequent, and Clara began accompanying Sam on the Saturday trips into Mill Haven. Not because he asked her to, but because it had become, without discussion, simply what they did. The town was changing toward her. Not dramatically. Not with any single moment of mass acceptance that was the kind of thing that happened in stories, not in real communities where people change their minds slowly, and with the particular stubbornness of those who dislike admitting they were wrong in the first place. But it was changing. The man at the general store. Mr. Pratt, she had learned his name, greeted her by name now. The woman at the seamstress shop on the East End had stopped the pointed avoidance and started nodding. 2 women at the last gathering had sought her out to speak with her about nothing specific, just to speak, which was its own language, in a small town, its own signal. Ruth Hale was at the center of most of it. "You've been campaigning for me," Clara told her on a Tuesday morning when Ruth appeared with preserves and the bright-eyed energy of someone with news she's been saving carefully. "I've been correcting inaccuracies," Ruth said with the precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and refused to call it anything less dignified. "There's a difference." "What kind of inaccuracies?" "The kind Margaret Cooper has been spreading with the particular industry of a woman who has nothing better to occupy her time." Ruth set the jar down on Clara's kitchen table. "I've simply been making sure that people hear the accurate version alongside the Cooper version and can decide for themselves." Clara looked at her. "What is the accurate version as you tell it? That you are a woman of considerable capability, who arrived in Mill Haven under false pretenses, not yours, theirs, and has proceeded to manage Sam Ward's household with more competence than it's seen in years, and that anyone who judges you based on your appearance is making exactly the kind of error that reflects poorly on them and not on you." Ruth picked up her coffee cup with the satisfaction of someone who has delivered a well-constructed sentence and knows it. "Accurate." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're a good friend, Ruth," she said. "Better than I've had in a long time." Ruth looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You haven't had many, have you?" It was not a question. "No," Clara said simply. "People tend to keep a certain distance." "Their loss." Ruth set the cup down with a small, decisive click. "Now, tell me what's happening with Sam." Clara looked at her hands. Nothing is happening with Sam. That's not what Tom says. What does Tom say? Ruth's eyes were knowing and warm in equal measure. Tom says Sam Ward laughs now, occasionally, which Tom has never seen in the 3 years they've been neighbors. Clara said nothing, but she felt the color move into her face, which happened rarely enough that it surprised her. That's the work, she said carefully. A functioning household, regular meals, someone to talk to. Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been married for 15 years and has developed through extended observation a finely calibrated understanding of what people mean when they say the opposite of what they mean. Of course, Ruth said pleasantly. The work. The laugh that Tom Hale had mentioned happened on a Thursday, 12 days before March ended, and it happened like this. Sam had come in from the barn with the specific expression of a man who has just had an encounter with an animal that did not go as planned. He was carrying his hat, which had a new tear in the brim that had not been there that morning. Clara looked up from the stove. She looked at the hat. She looked at his face. The gray mare, he said before she could ask. What did she do? She decided she didn't want to be in the barn today. He turned the hat over in his hands and examined the damage. She expressed this opinion on my hat. Clara looked at the hat again. She pressed her lips together. She was very focused on the stove. It's not funny, Sam said, though his voice had for the first time a very slight quality that contradicted his words. I'm not laughing. You're trying not to. I'm focusing on supper. He set the hat on the table. The tear was quite significant. She's bitten through the brim, he said with the tone of a man narrating an injustice. Clara turned from the stove. She looked at the hat. She looked at his face, the controlled, long-suffering expression of a practical man who has been professionally outwitted by a horse. And she laughed. It came out fully and genuinely, not the careful, polite sound she usually produced, but a real laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could calculate. Sam stared at her for a moment. And then, in the way that laughter is contagious between people who have been serious together for long enough, the corner of his mouth moved. Then the other corner, and Sam Ward, who Tom Hale had never seen laugh in 3 years, laughed genuine and low and a little rusty from disuse, like a door that needs oiling but still opens. It lasted maybe 15 seconds. When it passed, they were both quiet, and there was something different in the room, something warmer and more complicated than anything that had been there before. Clara turned back to the stove. I can mend the brim, she said. It won't be invisible, but it will hold. Don't bother, Sam said. He was still smiling just barely, just the residue of it. I'll wear it like this. People will notice. Let them wonder what the horse thought was so important. Clara shook her head. But she was smiling at the stove, and she knew he could see it from where he was standing, and neither of them mentioned it. The letter from Philadelphia arrived on a Friday. Clara saw the handwriting on the envelope and felt something cold move through her chest before she even opened it, because the handwriting was Mrs. Holloway's, and Mrs. Holloway did not write letters without reason. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it. The letter was short. Mrs. Holloway was not a woman who used more words than the situation required. It said that a man named Gerald Whitmore, Clara's cousin, a man she had not spoken to in 11 years, had written to the boarding house looking for Clara's address. He had apparently also written to several other people who might know her whereabouts. He had not explained why, but Mrs. Holloway, who had not provided the address, thought Clara should know he was looking. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. Gerald Whitmore. She had 11 years of reasons to feel uneasy at that name. He was her mother's sister's son, the kind of cousin who appears in family narratives as a peripheral figure until something shifts the balance of resources and then becomes suddenly urgently central. When Clara's parents died, Gerald had been 20 years old and had made very clear in the way of young men who believe they understand property and law better than they actually do, that he felt certain assets should be discussed. There were no significant assets. There was a small house that was mortgaged almost completely, and a few pieces of furniture. He had been disappointed. He had in that disappointment said several things to Clara that she had not forgotten. She had left Philadelphia 2 years after that and not looked back. What did he want now? She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her apron. She did not tell Sam that evening. She told herself she needed to think first, needed to understand what this meant before she brought it to anyone else. That was reasonable. That was practical. But the truth which she did not examine directly because she was not quite ready to, was that she was afraid of what it meant in the context of Millhaven, of the ranch, of the thing that was quietly and steadily building between her and Sam Ward. She had for the first time in years something she was afraid of losing. Die, she told Ruth the next Tuesday. Ruth read the letter twice, set it down, and looked at Clara with the sharpness of someone sorting quickly through implications. He's tracking you down, Ruth said. So it appears. After 11 years. Yes. What changed 11 years ago that he'd want to find you now? Ruth's voice was careful and precise. Nothing I can think of. Clara picked up her coffee. Unless something changed for him. What kind of man is he? Clara thought about the conversation after her parents died. Gerald at 20, angry about the absence of things, he felt entitled to turning that anger on the person most available to receive it. The kind who believes the world owes him something, she said, and who becomes unpleasant when it doesn't deliver on schedule. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Does Sam know? Not yet. Ruth looked at her with the careful directness of a woman who is choosing between saying what she thinks and saying what she's been asked. She chose what she thought. Tell him, Ruth said. Today. Not because you need his help, you may not, but because keeping this from him is the wrong kind of protection. He'll understand it better coming from you before it arrives from somewhere else. Clara knew she was right. She had known she was right before she came to Ruth. Sometimes you need someone to say the thing out loud that you already know, so you can stop working around it. She told Sam that evening after supper. She placed the letter on the table between them and let him read it without commentary. He read it twice, the same as Ruth. He set it down. He looked at Clara. Who is he? Direct as always. She told him briefly, factually, with the economy of someone who has long since decided not to give painful history more space than it deserves. The cousin. The conversation after the funeral. The 11 years of no contact. Sam listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, What do you think he wants? I don't know. She picked up the letter and unfolded it again. Nothing good. Nothing that inconveniences only him. He doesn't have your address. Mrs. Holloway didn't give it, but he's asking multiple people. She looked at Sam directly. If he's persistent enough, someone will tell him where I went. It's not difficult information to find if you're willing to ask enough people. Sam's jaw tightened, briefly controlled. What do you want to do? It was exactly the right question. Not what should we do, which would have presumed a partnership she hadn't yet asked for. Not what do you need from me, which would have cast her as someone requiring rescue. Just what do you want? I want to write back to Mrs. Holloway and find out exactly what he said in his letter to her, Clara said. And then I want to know before he appears, if he appears, so I'm not caught by surprise. That's reasonable, Sam said. Do it. He stood up and began clearing the table, which he had started doing somewhere in the last few weeks without being asked, and without comment, as if it had always been part of the shared arrangement. Clara watched him for a moment. Sam? He looked up. I'm telling you because you have a right to know what might be coming to your door, she said. Not because I need you to fix it. I want that to be clear. He looked at her steadily. I know that. I don't want you to think, Clara. His voice was quiet and very certain. I know who you are. You don't need to explain yourself to me. The words arrived simply without drama, and they went straight through every careful defense she had maintained, the careful systems of self-sufficiency and managed expectation that she had built over 31 years of being someone who could not afford to depend on anyone. She looked at the table. All right, she said. All right, he agreed. And they finished clearing the table in the quiet, ordinary, extraordinary way of two people who have crossed without quite acknowledging it into something new. The letter from Mrs. Holloway came back in 10 days. What it contained made Clara sit down slowly and read the page 3 times before she trusted herself to have understood it correctly. Gerald Whitmore was not coming to Colorado because of old grievances. He was coming because of a will. Their mutual great-aunt, a woman named Harriet Beaumont, who lived in Boston, whom Clara had met twice as a child and not thought of in 20 years, had died in January. She had left, according to Mrs. Holloway, who had spoken directly with the solicitor's office that had written to Gerald a small but not insignificant sum of money. And she had left it specifically and explicitly to Clara. Not to Gerald, to Clara. Mrs. Holloway's letter explained what the solicitor had told Gerald when he inquired about contesting the will that Harriet Beaumont had been quite deliberate in her choice, had amended the will 2 years before her death, and had left a written explanation that the solicitor was not at liberty to share, but that made the bequest unambiguous and legally sound. Gerald, the letter said, was contesting this, and he believed that finding Clara, specifically finding Clara before the legal process completed, gave him some advantage. Clara put the letter down on the kitchen table. She sat in the silence of the kitchen, her kitchen now the kitchen she had reorganized and learned and filled with the smell of real food and the small daily rituals of a household that functioned, and she felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the physical floor. Money. Real money, not the $4 a week margins she had been living within, calculating carefully, saving slowly. A bequest from a woman she barely remembered, who had seen something in Clara from a distance from memory, from whatever picture of Clara existed in Harriet Beaumont's mind, worth leaving something to. And Gerald, who had believed for 11 years that Clara had nothing worth pursuing, had suddenly discovered she did. She heard Sam's boots on the back step. She left the letter on the table where he would see it. He read it standing up still in his coat. She watched his face move through the information, the will, the bequest, Gerald's contest, the implication of Gerald's arrival. He set the letter down. "How much?" he asked. "The letter doesn't say a specific amount. Enough that Gerald finds it worth contesting across 1,000 miles. Sam looked at the letter again. "He's going to come here." "Probably. And when he gets here, what's his play?" His voice had the flat, analytical quality of a man working through a problem. "What does he gain by finding you before the legal process completes?" Clara had thought about this on the 10 days between sending her reply and receiving Mrs. Holloway's letter. She had thought about it with the careful, unsentimental clarity that she applied to all problems that required clear thinking rather than the comfort of hopeful interpretation. "He needs me to either contest the will myself, which I won't, or to sign something relinquishing the bequest, or to be in a position so precarious that I'm susceptible to a settlement offer." She kept her voice level. "He knew me 11 years ago as a woman with no money, no connections, and a face that meant people were unlikely to advocate for her. He believes I'm still in that position." Sam looked at her. "Are you?" The question was careful. He was asking whether the bequest changed what she wanted to do, whether it changed the calculation of the arrangement, whether it changed what was being built here. Clara looked at the letter. She thought about Harriet Beaumont, a woman she had met twice, who had nevertheless seen her clearly enough to think of her 20 years later, who had done something deliberate and specific and kind from beyond her own life. "It changes my options," Clara said carefully. "It doesn't change where I want to be." Sam's expression was very still. "You should be sure about that," he said quietly. "Money is money changes things. It should. It gives you choices you didn't have before. You don't have to stay anywhere you don't want to be, Clara, including here." It was the most honest and the most difficult thing he had said to her, because it cost him something. She could hear that it cost him something in the careful flatness of his voice, in the way he was looking at the letter and not at her. "Sam?" She waited until he looked up. "I'm staying because I want to stay, not because I have to. There is a difference." He held her eyes. "Yes," he said finally. "There is. And when Gerald Whitmore arrives," she continued, "I will deal with him the way I deal with everything directly, and without making it your problem to solve. "It's not a problem to me," he said. He stopped. "What?" He looked at her with an expression she had seen building slowly over weeks, an expression she had been careful not to name too early, because naming things too early could break them. "You're not on your own anymore," he said. "That's what I mean. Whatever that man brings when he comes, you're not handling it alone." The kitchen was quiet. The stove was warm. Outside March was finally reluctantly beginning to soften at its edges. "I know," she said. And this time, she didn't follow it with a qualifier, didn't soften it with a boundary, or a clarification, or the careful management of expectation that had been her survival mechanism for as long as she could remember. Just "I know." And it was enough. Gerald Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday, 9 days later. He arrived the way Clara had expected, without warning, which was itself a strategy. The belief that arriving unannounced put the other person at a disadvantage. She was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. She looked out. She recognized him immediately. 11 years had not changed the fundamental architecture of Gerald Whitmore, only elaborated on it. He was broader than he had been, with the specific broadness of a man who has eaten well consistently. High had the expression of someone who believes arrival is itself a statement. Clara took off her apron. She folded it once precisely and laid it on the table. She walked to the front door and opened it before he reached the steps. Gerald stopped. He had not expected her to open the door before he knocked. "Clara." He used her name the way people use names when they're trying to establish that they have the right to, without asking, without the courtesy of Miss Whitmore, without any of the social signals that acknowledge they have been absent for 11 years and have not earned familiarity. "Gerald." She kept her voice even. "This is a long way to travel without writing ahead. I wrote to your old address." He climbed the steps. He was looking at her face at the birthmark with the specific expression she remembered from the funeral. The expression of a man who had decided long ago that the birthmark was relevant information about Clara's worth, and was checking that his information was still current. "You moved." "I did." She did not step back from the doorway. "What do you want, Gerald?" He looked at the door, then at her with the expression of a man who expected to be invited in, and was recalibrating. "Can we speak inside?" he asked. "It's a cold morning." "We can speak here." Her voice was pleasant and completely immovable. "What do you want?" He recalibrated further. "I want to discuss Aunt Harriet's will. I think there's been a misunderstanding about her intentions. The will is legally clear. I've been in contact with the solicitor's office." Something moved in his face. "You've spoken to them." "I wrote to them when I heard you were looking for me." She kept her eyes on him. "I wanted to understand the situation before you arrived to explain it to me." He was quiet for a moment, reassessing the way people reassess when they discover the situation is less advantageous than anticipated. She was not well toward the end," he said. Her judgment was, the solicitor has a written explanation in her own hand, signed and witnessed, explaining her bequest. Clara's voice was still pleasant. 2 years before she died, when she was by all accounts in full health and clarity. I have a copy. Gerald's jaw tightened. "Clara, I would like you to hear me clearly, Gerald." She kept her voice the same level, unhurried, without cruelty. "I am not going to contest the will. I am not going to sign anything relinquishing the bequest. I am not going to enter into a settlement. I am going to allow the legal process to complete as Aunt Harriet intended." She paused. "If you want to continue contesting it, that's your right. But you should know that I have the solicitor's full support, and you are contesting the documented, witnessed, explicit wishes of a woman who was of sound mind when she made them." Gerald stared at her. He had arrived expecting she understood to find the Clara. He remembered the woman with no resources, no connections, no one to stand behind her. He had found something else. "You've changed," he said. The words were not a compliment. "Yes," she said simply. "I have." Behind her she heard the back door open and close, Sam returning from the barn. She heard his boots cross the kitchen floor. She heard him stop in the hallway. He did not come to the front door. He did not need to. But Gerald heard the footsteps, and Gerald looked past Clara toward the interior of the house, and Clara watched him understand, without being told, simply from the geography of the situation, that she was not alone in this house, that there was someone behind her who was present and aware and not leaving. Gerald looked back at Clara. Something had shifted in his calculation. "The solicitor's process," he said finally, "will take time." "It will." Clara nodded. "In the meantime, you've had a long journey. I'd suggest the hotel in town. Mrs. Garfield's dining room serves a decent supper." She stepped back. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing evenly, listening to Gerald's footsteps retreat down the front steps and back to the wagon. Sam appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked at her. "How did you know I was there?" he asked quietly. "I heard the back door," she said. "I didn't come in to intervene," he said. "I want you to know that. I heard the wagon and I came in to be present. In case you needed, I know." She looked at him steadily. "And I didn't need you to step in. But knowing you were there—" She stopped. "Made a difference," he said. She looked at the closed door. "Everything is different," she said quietly, "when you're not the only one in the room who cares what happens to you." The words came out before she had fully constructed them, before she could measure them, or qualify them, or protect herself from the vulnerability of them. Sam was quiet. Then he walked toward her, and he stopped when he was close enough that she could see the specific expression on his face. Clearly not uncertain, not careful, not the controlled blankness he had spent 3 years perfecting. Open. Completely, deliberately open. "Clara." His voice was low and direct. "I need to say something, and I need to say it plainly because I have spent most of my life not saying the things that mattered, and I am done with that." She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the ranch needs managing. Not because it's practical. Because this house has been. I have been. Something was missing for a long time, and I didn't have words for it, and now I do." He held her eyes without flinching. "You are what was missing. Not just here. From my life." The kitchen was completely still. Clara looked at this man, this quiet, disciplined, careful man, who had walked back to a cold train platform when everyone else had walked away, who had stood beside her in a crowded room, who had read his mother's letters and come back to the table and talked, who had stepped quietly into the hallway today, without being asked to intervene, simply to be present, simply to be there. She thought about her mother's thumb tracing the edges of the birthmark. It's a map of somewhere you're meant to go. She had traveled halfway across America and been rejected in 60 seconds, and found work on a struggling ranch 4 miles from town, and reorganized a kitchen and mended curtains, and made apple cake on days that weren't occasions, and sat with a man while he read letters he'd been afraid of for 3 years. And she had arrived somewhere, not where she expected, somewhere more real than what she expected. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Not as an answer to his question, as a fact clear and solid and decided. "I'm not going anywhere, Sam." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the gestures of romance that were performed in stories, just took her hand, the same firm, honest grip as the handshake they had exchanged on a cold Millhaven boardwalk, when they were still two strangers deciding whether to trust each other. Except now, they were not strangers, and this was not a business agreement. "Good," he said. And that was enough. That was everything, and the everything of it settled over the ranch, like the first genuine warmth of spring. Not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable and permanent, in the way that real things are permanent once they've been named. Gerald Whitmore stayed in Millhaven for 3 days. Clara knew because Ruth told her. Ruth, who had eyes everywhere in that town, the way good-hearted people always do, who noticed things and filed them away, not out of nosiness, but out of the genuine conviction that information shared among people who care about each other is a form of protection. He ate at Mrs. Garfield's dining room both evenings. He asked questions of the people he sat near, careful, indirect questions, the kind that are designed to sound like conversation while functioning as investigation. He asked about Sam Ward. He asked about the ranch. He asked with the particular delicacy of someone who wants information without appearing to want it, whether the arrangement between Sam and Clara was, and here people reported he paused, choosing his word permanent. Nobody gave him anything useful. Partly because Millhaven had, in the gradual and unannounced way of small communities, decided that Clara Whitmore was theirs now. Not the rejected mail-order bride. Not the woman with the mark on her face that the Coopers found unsuitable. There's the woman who ran Ward's ranch, who came to the gatherings with her head up, who had stood in front of a full room and told her own story plainly and without apology. You don't give information about your own to a stranger who arrives asking questions with that particular careful smile. On the third morning, Gerald came back to the ranch. Clara was not surprised. She had expected it, had prepared for it the way she prepared for all difficult things, by thinking it through completely in advance until the element of surprise was removed, and what remained was simply a situation to be handled. She was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. Sam was in the barn. She did not go to get him. She took off her apron, folded it, laid it on the table. She walked to the front door and opened it. Gerald was already on the steps. This time he'd moved faster than before, with the energy of a man who has spent 3 days reorganizing his approach and is ready to deploy it. Clara. He had shifted his tone, less presumptuous than the first visit, more reasonable, conciliatory, the tone of someone who has decided that the direct approach failed and the sympathetic approach might work better. I want to start over. Our first conversation wasn't what I intended. What did you intend? She asked. I wanted to talk, like family. He looked at her with an expression that he had clearly practiced, open, regretful, the expression of a man acknowledging past wrongs without being specific about what they were. We're the only family. Each other has left Clara. I've thought about that. I think we both said things years ago that we shouldn't have. Clara looked at him. She thought about the conversation after her parents' funeral. Gerald at 20, the words he had used, the particular cruelty of someone who had decided that her face was relevant evidence in an argument about worth. She had never said anything cruel to him, but she did not correct the implication. What do you want, Gerald? She said. Same words as before, same tone. His expression shifted, the practiced openness tightening at the edges. I want a settlement, something fair to both of us. Aunt Harriet. She wasn't close to either of us, really. The bequest was a gesture, not it wasn't intended to create conflict in the family. The written explanation she left with the solicitor suggests she was quite deliberate, Clara said. I have a copy, as I mentioned. His jaw tightened. You'd spend more fighting the contest than settling. The solicitor doesn't believe so. Clara kept her eyes steady on his face. And I'm not going to settle, Gerald. I've already told you that. He was quiet for a moment. Then something changed in his expression. The practiced version fell away, and what was underneath it was the thing she remembered from 11 years ago. The raw, unmanaged frustration of a man who believed the world was arranged incorrectly when it didn't arrange itself around him. You have no idea what to do with money, he said. The words came out with the particular sharpness of someone abandoning strategy for honesty. You've spent your life in other people's houses doing other people's work. A sum like that, you'll mismanage it inside a year. Clara breathed in once. Is that what you think? She said quietly. I think... He stopped himself. He was trying to pull the practiced expression back. He was not entirely succeeding. I think we could manage it better together, as a family. We are not a family, Clara said. Clear, calm, final. We share a bloodline. That's not the same thing. His expression hardened fully. You're going to regret this. I've regretted things in my life, she said. Standing my ground about money that was left to me by someone who chose to leave it to me is not going to be one of them. She stepped back. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway, and she listened to Gerald Whitmore's footsteps on the steps across the ground back to the wagon. She listened to the wagon move. She stood there until the sound was gone. Then Sam appeared at the end of the hallway, coat on, from the back door, and she understood without asking that he had come in when he heard the wagon had stood somewhere behind her, present again, available, but not intervening. He's gone, Sam asked. He's gone. She turned to look at him. He won't come back. He has nothing left to try. Sam looked at her carefully. Are you all right? She thought about the question. The same question he had asked her after the gathering. The question she had answered honestly then and would answer honestly now. Yes, she said. I am. She paused. He called us family. He said we're the only family each other has left. Sam waited. He's wrong, she said. About the family part. I have... She stopped. She looked at Sam. At the kitchen behind him, warm and organized and smelling of this morning's coffee. At the hallway that led to her room, the room with the lock that she had never needed to use. I have more family right now than I've had since I was 9 years old. Sam's expression did the thing it did, the thing she had learned to read, the stripping away of the careful control, the brief, real opening of it. Yes, he said quietly. You do. The solicitor's letter arrived 6 weeks later in May, when the Colorado spring had finally committed fully, and the ranch had the particular quality of a place that has survived winter and emerged from it with more character than it went in with. The bequest was confirmed. Gerald's contest had been reviewed and declined on the grounds that the will was explicit witnessed and accompanied by a written explanation that demonstrated the solicitor wrote in careful legal language, clear and deliberate intent on the part of Harriet Beaumont. The amount was $420. Clara sat at the kitchen table and read the number twice. $420. She had been living on $4 a week. She had been calculating her future in the smallest possible margins, had spent 31 years in the position of a woman who could not afford to need anything she didn't already have. $420. She set the letter down. She put both hands flat on the table. She breathed. Sam came in from outside, saw her at the table, saw the letter, saw her hands flat and her eyes somewhere far away. He sat down across from her without speaking. She pushed the letter toward him. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. What do you want to do with it? He asked. She had been thinking about this, not since the letter arrived, but for the weeks before it arrived in the careful, methodical way she thought through things that mattered. Some of it I want to save, she said. Properly save. In a bank account in my name. She paused. I've never had a bank account in my name. Sam nodded. That's right. And some of it. She stopped. She looked at the letter, then at him. The east fence line. You said it needs proper repair, not just patching. And the barn roof. And there are 3 things on the supply list that you've been delaying because of the cost. Sam was very still. Clara, let me finish. She kept her voice even. I know this ranch. I've been managing this household for 3 months, and I understand the margins you're working with. The fence line and the barn roof are not optional repairs. They're deferred costs that will become larger costs if they're left. Using some of this money on the ranch is... She met his eyes. It's an investment. In something I'm part of. Sam looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight, not with anger, with the particular tension of a proud man receiving something he's not sure he can accept. This is your money, he said. Harriet Beaumont left it to you. She left it to me to use with judgment, Clara said. And my judgment says the ranch needs it, and I want to contribute it. She paused. You gave me a room and a salary when you didn't have to. You stood beside me in that gathering room. You were in the hallway this morning. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it had caught like a thread on a rough edge. You don't have to keep doing everything alone either, Sam. Silence. A long silence. The specific silence of a man, dismantling piece by careful piece. The conviction that accepting help from someone who loves you is a form of weakness. The east fence would run about $60, he said quietly. I know. I calculated. The barn roof is more. 75, maybe 80 with the materials from Pratt's. I know that too. He looked at her hands still flat on the table. He put his hand over hers. Not the firm handshake of strangers, deciding to trust each other. Not the deliberate grip of the hallway 4 weeks ago. Something quieter. Something that said, I'm here and I'm staying, and I understand what you're offering, and I'm not going to pretend I don't need it. All right, he said. His voice was rough at the edges, the roughness of someone who has held things too tightly for too long and is just now beginning to release the grip. "All right," she said. And they sat there in the kitchen of the ranch that was becoming, without ceremony or announcement, theirs both of them equally, while the May sun came through the window and the coffee went cold, and neither of them moved to fix it, because some moments are more important than warm coffee, and they both knew it. The proposal, when it came, was nothing like what Clara had read about in the novels that circulated through the boarding house in Philadelphia. Nothing like the dramatic declarations, or the formal kneeling, or the practiced speeches of men who had thought carefully about the performance of the thing. It came on a Thursday evening in late May. They were on the porch after supper, a habit they had developed as the weather warmed the two of them, sitting in the evening with coffee, not always talking, comfortable in the silence, the way people are comfortable in silence when they've stopped needing to fill it. Sam said, "I need to ask you something." Clara looked at him. His expression was the open one, fully open, no careful control, no managed distance. "I know this isn't what you came here for," he said. "I know you came to marry a man you'd corresponded with, who turned out to be not worth the correspondence." He paused. "And I know what you've built here. You've built on your own terms, with your own work, and I don't want you to think that what I'm going to ask has anything to do with the ranch or the money or anything practical." Clara waited. "I'm asking because I want to," he said. "Because this house has been more itself in 5 months with you in it than it was in the 3 years before, and because I'm a better man when I'm not alone in this." He stopped. He looked at her directly. "Will you marry me, Clara?" Not Edward Cooper, who had never looked at her face for more than 3 seconds. Not the theoretical husband of Margaret Cooper's carefully curated correspondence. This man. This specific, difficult, honest, gradually opening man, who had walked back to a cold platform and offered her something real and practical, and had kept offering real things ever since. Clara looked at him. She thought briefly and completely about the woman who had left Philadelphia with one suitcase and a letter promising a new beginning, the woman who had sat on her luggage on a freezing platform and refused by sheer stubbornness to cry in public. That woman had traveled across America looking for someone who would see her. She had found him in the last place she expected, not waiting for her, not arranged, not corresponding in careful handwriting from 1,000 miles away, but standing on a platform when everyone else had left, noticing that she was still refusing to break. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, completely, without qualification or condition, or any of the protective hedging she had spent 31 years placing around her most important statements. Just yes. Sam's expression moved the particular movement of a man releasing something he has been holding for a long time, relief and warmth and something close to wonder all at once. He reached over and took her hand. They sat on the porch in the May evening, and they didn't say anything more for a while, and the silence was the best kind of silence, full, not empty, weighted with everything that had been said and everything that didn't need to be said because it was already understood. They were married in June at the Millhaven Church on a Saturday morning when the weather cooperated in the specific way that Colorado weather cooperates, when it feels like it completely and brilliantly without reservation. Ruth Hale organized most of it with the efficient joy of a woman who has been waiting for a specific event and approaches its arrival with the energy of someone who has been conserving it for exactly this purpose. Tom Hale stood with Sam. Clara wore the best dress she owned. She had made alterations to it herself the week before with the needle and thread she always carried, because she was a woman who had learned to carry what she needed rather than hoping it would be available when required. She did not cover the birthmark. She had not covered it in 5 months. She would not cover it today. She walked to the front of that small church with her head up and her shoulders straight and her eyes on Sam Ward, who was watching her come toward him with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and has decided to spend the rest of his life being worthy of it. When she reached him, he took her hand, the same hand every time, the same certainty. The Reverend spoke. Clara heard the words, and they were the right words, the real words, the words that meant what they were supposed to mean between two people who were choosing each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing. When it was done, Ruth was crying, which she would later deny with great conviction. Tom Hale shook Sam's hand with the particular grip of a man expressing through a handshake everything he would consider too sentimental to say directly. Mr. Pratt from the general store was there, and two women who had sought Clara out at the last gathering just to speak, and the Reverend's wife and a handful of ranching families who had watched from a careful distance the gradual transformation of Ward's Ranch from a place of isolated function to a place of genuine life. And Margaret Cooper was not there. She had not been invited, not out of bitterness. Clara had burned through bitterness months ago and found nothing useful in the ash, but because some people belong to the part of the story that happens before the real story begins. And once the real story is underway, there is simply no role for them to fill. The summer brought work as it always did on the frontier. Relentless physical necessary work that neither of them resented, because they had both been people who found something clarifying in the dignity of labor, in the knowledge that what you were building was real, because you were building it with your actual hands. The east fence was repaired properly. The barn roof held. The kitchen ran with the smooth, organized efficiency of a household, managed by someone who understood the difference between a house and a home, and had decided deliberately to make this the latter. Sam laughed more. Not constantly. He was still the man. He was still economical with words, still more comfortable with action than declaration, but regularly genuinely, with the specific quality of a man who has remembered that the capacity for it was always there, only waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Clara wrote to Mrs. Holloway in August. She wrote a long letter, longer than she usually wrote anything, because Mrs. Holloway deserved the full account, and because Clara found now that she had more to say than she had ever had before. She described the ranch. She described Ruth. She described the gathering and the letter from Harriet Beaumont and Gerald's visit and the solicitor's confirmation. She described Sam, not with the overflowing language of someone who has never been happy before and cannot contain the novelty of it, but with the specific careful language of a woman who understood what she had and was not taking any of it for granted. He is the kind of man, she wrote, who notices things other people walk past. I have needed that my whole life, without knowing that was what I needed. Someone to notice. Mrs. Holloway wrote back within 2 weeks promptly by her standards, which meant the letter had moved something in her. She said she was glad. She said she always believed it would work out, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of generous revision that people make when someone they care for has landed safely. She said, I worried about you going so far alone, but perhaps you had to go that far to find what was worth finding. Clara read that line 3 times. She folded the letter along its creases, the way she had folded every important letter of her life, and placed it in the small wooden box she had carried from Philadelphia. The box now held 3 things: Mrs. Holloway's first worried letter, the solicitor's confirmation of Harriet Beaumont's bequest, and a photograph that Sam had given her quietly the week after they married, the photograph of him and his mother, the one that had fallen from the box behind the chair. He had pressed it into her hand one morning without preamble and said, She would have wanted you to have this too, not just me. Clara had looked at the photograph, that strong-faced woman with the direct eyes, and she had felt something she couldn't entirely name. Something between grief for a woman she had never met and gratitude for the life that woman had shaped. She put the photograph in the box. It belonged there. In September, something happened that Clara had not anticipated and that undid her more thoroughly than anything else, more than the platform, more than Gerald, more than any of it. A woman came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon. She was young, 20, maybe 21, with the specific look of someone who had been traveling for longer than they expected and was not entirely sure what they would find at the end of it. She had a birthmark, smaller than Clara's, on her neck extending down toward her collarbone, but visible, unmistakable, and she moved with the posture that Clara recognized with the full-body recognition of personal history, the shoulders turned slightly inward, the chin that wanted to lower but was being held up by a deliberate, exhausting effort. I was told... The young woman stopped at the gate. Her voice was uncertain. Someone in town told me that the woman here that you... She stopped again. She looked at Clara standing in the doorway. She looked at the birthmark on Clara's face. Something moved in her expression. Not relief, not yet, but the beginning of something that might become relief if it was given the right conditions. "What's your name?" Clara asked. "Eliza Marsh." "Where are you from, Eliza?" "Kansas, originally." A pause. "I came west because—" She stopped. "Someone arranged a position for me, as a housekeeper for a family in the next town. But when I arrived, they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Clara understood the rest of it completely. She had lived the rest of it. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "Have you eaten today?" Eliza Marsh looked at her for a moment. This woman with the birthmark on her face, who was standing in the doorway of a working ranch, straight-backed and steady-voiced, and offering food to a stranger on a Tuesday afternoon. "Not since this morning," Eliza said. "Come in," Clara said again. The young woman came inside. Clara made food practical hot, the food of a kitchen that always had enough, because it was managed by someone who planned for exactly this kind of unexpected need. Eliza ate. Clara sat across from her, the way Sam had sat across from her that first night, present, not pressing, allowing the meal to be what it was before the conversation had to be anything. When Eliza finished, she looked up. "How did you—" She paused. "How do you—" She couldn't quite formulate the question, but Clara heard it anyway, heard the whole question underneath the incomplete words. "How do you hold your head up? How do you walk into rooms? How do you become a person who offers food to strangers on a Tuesday, instead of sitting on a suitcase on a cold platform, watching everyone walk past?" Clara thought about everything she could say. She thought about the platform, and Sam, and the gathering, and Gerald and Harriet Beaumont's deliberate bequest, and Mrs. Holloway's letter, and the photograph in the wooden box. She thought about a man who had walked back when everyone else had kept going. "You find one person," she said, "who looks at your whole face." She kept her eyes on Eliza steadily. "Just one. And then you understand that the people who don't, that says something about what they're willing to see, not about what you're worth." Eliza was very still. "And until you find that person," Clara continued, "you practice looking at your own whole face, every morning, without looking away." She paused. "It's hard. It takes time. But you practice it." The kitchen was quiet. Then Eliza said very quietly, "Did it get easier?" Clara thought about the honest answer. The true answer, the one that wasn't about comfort, but about accuracy. "It got different," she said. "Easier is the wrong word. Different. The mark is still there. People still look at it. But what it means, what I let it mean, that changed." She paused. "Because I stopped letting it be the first thing I told myself about myself." Sam came in from outside at some point during this. She heard his boots, heard him read the room immediately with the particular sensitivity he had developed over months of living with a woman who noticed everything. Heard him pour himself a coffee and sit quietly at the far end of the table without intruding. Present. Available. Not intervening. Eliza stayed 2 days. She slept in the room at the end of the hall, the room with the lock on the door which Clara had never needed to use and which now served a different purpose, the purpose of making a young woman feel safe in a house full of strangers. On the second morning, Ruth Hale came by because Ruth always knew when she was needed, which was one of the many reasons Clara had decided she was the best friend she had ever had. And by the end of that visit, Ruth had arranged a legitimate housekeeping position for Eliza, with a family she personally vouched for and trusted. When Eliza left, she stopped at the gate and turned back. She looked at Clara standing in the doorway. "Thank you," she said. And it came out the way real gratitude comes out, stripped of performance, direct from somewhere genuine. Clara nodded once. She watched Eliza walk down the road toward town. She felt Sam come to stand beside her, not behind her, beside her, the same position he had taken in the gathering room all those months ago. "You didn't tell me she was coming," he said. "I didn't know she was coming." A pause. "You handled it," he said. Not a question. An observation with the specific quality of admiration that he expressed through observation, rather than declaration. "We handled it," Clara said. "You sat at the end of the table and didn't say a word, and that was exactly right." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Your mother was right," she said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. In the letters. Clara kept her eyes on him. A home needs more than one person to be what it's supposed to be. She paused. She was exactly right. Sam was quiet for a moment. Then, she was right about most things. His voice was the rough-edged voice, the one that meant something true was being said. I should have listened sooner. You listened when you were ready, Clara said. That's all anyone can do. They stood at the doorway of the ranch together in the September morning, and the road was empty, where Eliza had been, and the mountains were there on the horizon, the same as always, massive and permanent and completely indifferent to individual human struggles, which had always been somehow comforting rather than cold. Because the mountain's indifference meant that what happened to you, you made happen, and what you built yourself, and what you became you chose. Clara Whitmore. Clara Ward now had crossed half of America in a train with one suitcase and $14 and a birthmark, and the stubborn refusal to let other people's vision of her become her vision of herself. She had been rejected on a platform in 60 seconds by people who looked at her face and decided they already knew everything worth knowing. She had sat on her luggage in the cold and watched everyone walk past. And one man had walked back, not because she needed saving. She had never needed saving, had always been the kind of woman who saved herself. But because he saw what everyone else had walked past without stopping to see a woman standing alone freezing, but still refusing to break. The first thing people noticed about her was not the most important thing about her. It had taken 31 years and 1,000 miles, and one quiet man on a cold platform to make that something she carried in her bones rather than just her mind. But she carried it now, completely. And she would carry it every morning for the rest of her life when she stood at her own mirror and looked at her whole face without flinching, and she would carry it when the next Eliza Marsh came down the road, uncertain and hungry and hollow, with the specific exhaustion of being seen wrong for too long. And she would carry it in this house, this home, this life that two people had built from the raw materials of their separate broken histories into something neither of them could have constructed alone. The mark on her face had not changed. But the woman who wore it had become finally and completely and without apology exactly who she was always meant to be. And that was not the end of the story. That was the beginning of the only story that had ever mattered. The one where Clara Whitmore stopped waiting to be seen by the right people and became instead someone who saw.